Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski. Now, this is a really interesting fight, and if you've close to the UFC and you've obviously heard the other pundits have a chat, you already have an opinion that a large portion of the fight audience, including a lot of former fighters, believe that Max Holloway won this fight. And there's a bias in my corner because I'm filming this in Australia, and obviously we support Volkanovski here. I agree. I totally agree with the sentiment that potentially Max Holloway won this fight. Now listen, here's the interesting thing about this fight. And to me, there's one key word, and the key word is context. Now hear me out. There are 5 rounds in this fight. A lot of pundits have Max easily winning rounds 1 and 2, including yours truly. A lot of pundits have Volkanovski easily winning rounds 4 and 5, which really leaves round 3, which coincidentally happens to be the middle round, as really the deciding round, whether Max won that round or whether Alex won that round, and really the singular round that's under contention by a lot of individuals. Now hear me this. The position of this particular round has great bearing in terms of how the totality of this decision was manufactured. What do I mean by this? Well, let's think about it. If you were to isolate and watch this round in isolation, forget about rounds 1 and 2 and round 2 and 3, as its own unique story, you come up with a very different outcome. So what has happened here, amongst a lot of other things, and maybe a gross oversimplification in terms of what occurred, is Volkanovski, with the momentum that he has driven in totality in the rounds of 4th and 5th, which were and are the championship rounds, has managed to sneak away, with what is a rather impressive victory. So you can say, hey, Kev, are you saying that middle round was, won in context of rounds 4 and 5? I'm saying in isolation, in a vacuum, it's potentially what gave Alexander Volkanovski the win here. Now let's rewind everything back and chat about the actual fight and the techniques that were displayed here. Now this was a really interesting fight in that obviously fought under the COVID-19 situations. There were a lot of different things happening. I've actually had a lot of Alexander Volkanovski content, specifically pertaining to talking to some of the training partners in terms of the who's who and the elite fighters of Australia that Alexander Volkanovski trained with. I've got a video on Josh Kulabau, which you can check out in the channel, and Martin Nguyen, just to name drop a couple of fighters that he trained with. Now, this is interesting to note because Alex needed live bodies to get his training done, and really, his base is usually in New Zealand and City Kickboxing. So he made a big adjustment there, and obviously there are other guys as well that I didn't mention, Alan Philippot, just to name a few. There were a couple of other gentlemen that he trained with. Now, let's isolate this to Max Holloway. According to Max Holloway in the interviews that he's done with notable MMA pundits, a la Ariel Helwani, Brett Okamoto, ESPN, etc., that he never physically trained or never physically sparred here. Now, that's amazing. If that's actually true, that's amazing, considering the sharpness that we saw Max Holloway come through. Apparently, he only chatted with his coaches via Zoom. So again, contextually, if we think about all of that, it's amazing. So in terms of the fight himself, and there was a vast difference, a lot of individuals, including myself, saw this fight going the same way because in a lot of rematches, we see that often, and again, this is a gross generalization, the same narratives in terms of the same tendencies seem to flow through. And potentially, we thought that this was going to manifest itself in this fight, but were we wrong? So interestingly enough, if we were to break down the fighters, Max Holloway is a rhythm fighter. He doesn't come with a lot of heat in his punches, but he has enough heat and enough rhythm to land early, often, and frequently. Rhythm is cadence. Rhythm is frequency. And the establishment of this early on is really the biggest difference that we see in the second fight versus the first fight. Now, what do I mean by this specifically? Well, specifically, there were some micro adjustments that were made here. And one is Max was actually fighting to the potential of his length, keeping things at distance. Secondly, he was utilizing kicks quite often from an offensive perspective. Now, this is interesting because, and it was interesting enough, if you watch UFC Embedded, you saw Volkanovski, I think in the second or third episode, make fun, jokingly, obviously, that he was a point fighter and talking about these little kicks. Now, these were the kicks that they were administering in the fight one. And while he was doing the same thing in fight two, they did not have either the same pep, or now that Max had understood that, he was doing kicks back from an offensive perspective. It seemed that every kick that Volkanovski would do, Max would give it back. And with the length, the combination of the length that Max had and the frequency that he was landing with the kicks and the punches, it seemed that he was establishing that level of distance. He was able to establish a new level of frequency and cadence in his punches. And my word, they were effective. They were very effective. I believe that Volkanovski got dropped in the first and the second round with uppers at very awkward angles, but effectively, systematically, Max was breaking down and understanding Alexander's, feints, which were obviously a really, really big reason that he won fight one. He was able to withstand the kick barrage, but more importantly, he was able to give back heat from a kicking distance as well as a punching distance. And when he this combination of cadence and frequency was able to allow him to get a new level of rhythm. And this was a rhythm that Alexander Volkanovski found really hard to disrupt throughout the period of the fight. And we saw this manifest. Now, the third round, if we think of that in totality, it was a very close round. I believe when the stats were elevated at the end of the fight, there was a difference of 2 strikes from a striking differential perspective that separated these fighters, just to show how close that was. So really, again, if you think of it in isolation, if the third round was the final round in that fight, you would have said, honestly, in my opinion, that Max would have won all 3 rounds. Now, what's interesting is in the 4th round, I made commentary here because I kind of wanted to believe that Volkanovski had a chance. He started pursuing the takedown, and this to me was a really critical point in the fight, where he kind of had a mental understanding that he was not necessarily winning the stand-up war and had to change levels here. And to Volkanovski's credit, even though he was a smaller fighter, he was able to establish, and initiate contact and get Max down, albeit not for very long and not very effectively in that particular regard. But it's that combination of the threat of the takedown mixed with a lot more intensity in terms of his fights and throughput and output. We were able to see, the conditioning of Alexander Volkanovski really hold through in the 4th round. Now imagine this, where the 4th round was almost the round that a lot of people had easily, Alexander Volkanovski winning. I think I tweeted this, but I asked if I could allow myself to believe that it was 2-2 at that stage, because the thing is, the 3rd round was on thin ice. The 4th round was Volkanovski's. And really, the 5th round, Volkanovski continued that throughput. Max was trying to evade. There were some really good skirmishes and exchanges here. But again, Volkanovski, persisted with the takedown, was able to get that. And really, again, you see the totality of context being built up to display this narrative. When this fight was being called, as soon as I found out early on there was going to be a split decision, you could kind of, it was tense. It was tense because really upon the conclusion of this, a lot of people had thought that, oh, wait, this is very similar to Dan Hooker, Dustin Poirier, in the sense that Hooker, had early rounds, a la what Max had, but you saw Dustin Poirier come through. And it's interesting because when you talk to a lot of pundits, everyone is happy with that as their outcome. Why is that? I mean, we've got to say that Hooker gave a lot of damage early on. I think it's just the way, right? When you're coming through with strikes and you're able to visibly see the damage, it really elicits a different response from not only judges, but, users. In the same particular regard, the damage really was being done by Volkanovski with the takedowns. It's point fighting. You know what I mean? It's not totality of damage. If it was totality of damage, all you had to do was see the face of Volkanovski and the face of Max Holloway to see who your clear winner was there. So, look, it was really interesting. There's a lot of uproar about this fight, and understandably so. I can definitely appreciate and understand that. But look, take nothing away from Alexander Volkanovski. A lot of fighters do not make adjustments. And talking to a lot of fighters out there, there is that fight or flight mentality that really kicks in from a individual's perspective, and really for him to be able to adjust on the fly. And in my mind, by the second round, if I was in the corner, I would have presented basically a series of outcomes to Alex and just tell him that I felt that he needed to kind of go in and basically eat a little bit more strikes to deal it. But to his credit, he was able to find a different way. And Urquhart, what has been in the media landscape, at least, quite a controversial win, but well deserved. However way you think about it, even if you're pro Volkanovski here, pro Holloway here. Where to from here from both guys? Look, in my mind, there's definitely enough history, and Dana White has come out and said that the judging was dodgy, and if you're Volkanovski, man, you shrug that off, but you obviously might not feel ideal about the scenario, but mate, he's a champion. He's an absolute stud and a champion. So look, from here, I think he needs to take on someone new. I think you need to feed Holloway someone new and build up that fight. But there's definitely a third fight there. It makes no sense. And if I was Volkanovski, it just absolutely, for diversity's sake and for narrative's sake, it makes sense to give a little bit of a pause, a break there in terms of that as a trilogy. But that fight is there, especially if both fighters continue the trajectory of winning that we anticipate rather than to have. So look, man, that was an interesting fight. What do you think? Do you think Max won? Do you think Alex won? What do you think is next for both of these guys? Leave a comment. Give us a thumbs up if you like what you're seeing, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Chat soon. Peace.